you have a practice or are you running a business? Valuation is the ultimate KPI.
Hey there, it's Mike Lankford. Welcome to another episode of the Modern Financial Advisor Podcast, brought to you by Truelytics, the one and only comprehensive advisor transition management platform. This week on the show, I am joined by George MacAllister of The Next Level Solution to explore the power of storytelling for modern financial advisors and for leaders at wealth management firms. Now, I have a feeling you're really going to enjoy this episode and find it engaging because, well, we're talking about stories, right? Stories are enjoyable and engaging, hopefully. But one of the areas where I think you're going to enjoy most, at least I hope so, is we talk about using stories in the practice acquisition process. And that was a bit of a curveball I threw George because I send these little prep notes over to any guest who's going to be on the show. Like, hey, here's 4 or 5 topics I'd like to cover and just a couple little quick questions and so forth. And it's not really a script. It's just so that the guest feels prepared, right? Well, I didn't send them this question. And frankly, it just didn't dawn on me until we were in the middle of the conversation. So I asked it. And when that type of thing happens, I figure, well, either the guest will do really well or they won't. And if they don't do well, I'll just have it edited out of the podcast. Well, George knocked it out of the park. So I really think you're going to get a lot out of that. And why I think that's important is, many of the users of Truelytics and many of the listeners, I suspect, are thinking about M&A, right? Merging with another business, acquiring another advisor's business, or maybe even selling their own business, right? So having this story component about why you want to buy, why you want to sell is kind of important, right? So pay attention to this episode. I hope you get a lot out of that. I'd love to hear your thoughts on George's techniques because I love them, just to be honest with you. On a side note, by the way, before we get started, it's important to recognize that there are lots of ways to tell a story. True performance, for instance, tells the story of your business, right? The valuation and the 50 key performance indicators, they tell a story of how your business is performing when compared to others in its peer group. Your Truelytics grades tell a story of how stable and strong your business is. And here's the cool thing about that story. It's still being written by you and your team. So if you see an opportunity for improvement, you can write the next chapter by making adjustments. I think sometimes it helps to think of your business in the abstract like that. It's powerful, just like the techniques George shares in this episode. By consuming information as a story, it helps you process the benchmarks and the data points in new and meaningful ways. Okay, assuming you've liked and subscribed to the podcast, like I suggest, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, or wherever you like to get your podcast jam on, and you have followed Truelytics on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook, I'd say we're pretty much ready to go. So it's story time. Grab your beverage, take a seat, and let's get to it with George MacAllister. Well, George, it is really exciting to have you on the show. I've enjoyed our conversations that we've had offline before this, and I'm really glad that Jeremy Carnell and Terry Mullen put us together because you and Terry, as you were talking to me about in prep, go way, way back. So welcome to the show, buddy.
Well, thank you very much. I am thrilled to be here. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I wonder if you could share a little bit about your journey in the industry, because what I found really intriguing as you told kind of your little bit of a history there is, you kind of go back to the early days of the financial advisory business industry as we know it, right? Because if a lot of people forget that this is a new industry, right?
I could be one of the first guys,
There
really.
you go.
I started at Merrill Lynch in 1980 as a stock jockey, really.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. I was in the business a week. My business card said stockbroker, and they gave us a new one, and it said financial advisor.
Isn't that interesting?
I was the same guy, and I was just a stock jockey, really. But I did that for 10 years as an advisor. And then I began wholesaling. I did that for about 10 years. I worked with Terry. And then after that, I did a lot of wholesaler development, training and development, a lot of speaking. Terry had me everywhere, speaking to advisors in large part because the wholesalers would set something up and I would come in and speak to advisors. He had me in 41 states and 8 countries. Yeah,
Wow.
all over the planet, it seemed like. But yeah, I've been kicking around for a while. I could have been one of the first people, I think.
Well, what I like about that, and the reason why I asked about that, and it's not to kind of like, sorry about like, put some dates on our, and it's not because of that. It's like there's a wisdom and a perspective that comes from seeing an industry evolve and change over time, right? Just like, we look at some of the people who were there at the early days of the dot-com revolution, right? The internet revolution in the early to mid 90s, before your average American had an email address and was surfing the web, and way before we all had, smartphones in our hand 90% of our waking hours, right? There's a wisdom that comes from that. And there's a perspective, because you get to see things in their infancy, you get to see them evolve and change. And not only are you seeing the products change and the business names change and evolve, but you're seeing the people. Because you mentioned, right? Like your first business card said stockbroker.
Yeah.
And I've said it many times on this show, guys were called stockbrokers. Like that's what you had people had a broker. They didn't have a financial advisor. They might have had a broker and an accountant, right? That's what they had. There was no name of a profession called financial advisor. And then suddenly
Right.
there was.
Yeah, that's right. And there was poor consumers had very precious little information or at their disposal, and they had to call their broker. If you want to know earnings per share for Exxon, you had to call me.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was that's what you had to do in those days. But yeah, things have changed dramatically, and so
Yeah.
has the consumers have had the benefit of tremendous changes for them because they know a lot more, so much more than they ever did before. So and they're more sophisticated. They're
Sure.
far more sophisticated. And what we used to peddle stocks, you couldn't get away with that today. You couldn't get away with that today. You got to come up with something better than that, George.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, exactly. Well, what's interesting too, like, so the industry shifted, I think, toward the good. I mean, some of that surely came through regulatory pressure and so forth. But
Sure.
the industry shifted to the good of, like, instead of trying to sell and move product, you started to help clients achieve their goals, right? Like using their money as a tool to achieve the things that are important in their life, like saving for retirement, like saving for a college education, or planning to leave a legacy, and all those types of things that we take for granted now. But the process evolved. And I bring it up all the time that many of the advisors that are at the tail end of their business now, right? That you would say they're probably in the last 10 years or so of their career. They'll likely be transitioning out either through succession planning, outright selling the business, or frankly, just age, father time catches up with everybody. Most of those people got started as stockbrokers,
Yeah.
and they've had to evolve. So life's a little different for them now, and the way that they're looking at things. One of the reasons why we wanted to have you on the show, you and I kind of discovered this during our initial conversation when I was introduced to you, was your penchant for teaching advisors how to tell stories, right? You have this passion for using the art of storytelling in the sales process. So I thought we'd dive into that here, because I love stories. In fact, I'm trying to get better at this. I'm not sure if I mentioned this to you before, but I have like this goal of mine, using this podcast medium. I want to get better at it. So there's this guy named Malcolm Gladwell. He's an author. He used to be write for the New Yorker, and I think the New York Times at some point in time. But he has a podcast as well. And it just, every time I've listened to him speak, whether it's a TED talk or on his podcast, the storytelling is just amazing, right? And it
Yeah. Oh
captivates.
yeah.
And
Great storyteller.
love it, right? And so I keep telling myself, like, I gotta get better at this. I really have to get better. So I was really excited. I want to learn from you today. I want to kind of pick your brain and find out what you know, and maybe the audience can learn a little bit more. So kind of to set the stage, we've all heard the old advice that if you want to make a point, tell a story, and if you tell a story, have a point, right? So,
Yeah.
what should advisors and frankly the RIA firms and broker dealers that are recruiting them, why should they take the concept of storytelling seriously?
Yeah. Well, that's a very good question. I have to tell you first of all that as an advisor for 10 years, I don't suppose I ever told a story, not on purpose, maybe by
Hmm,
mistake, I
okay.
I didn't see a fit for that. I don't believe it was ever even discussed really. And the first 4 or 5 years that I wholesaled, I never told story. I didn't have time for that, Mike. I'm selling my stuff. I got to sell stuff. And so there was no time for stories. I didn't understand the the possibility of using stories strategically, how powerful they are. And I really didn't understand that this is fundamental. Storytelling is the preferred method of communicating between human beings. It's always been this way. It'll always be this way. It goes back to cavemen. When they went out hunting for a bear and they came back, they told stories about the bear, about the hunting. And your parents read to you, you read to your kids, they'll read to their kids. But I used to read to my granddaughter, Libby, and she was 2.5. I remember her favorite book was Susie the Squirrel. Great book. But I would get to the.
Don't tell me how it ends. I haven't finished it yet.
You get to the end of that book, and I'd complete it. She's sitting on my lap. She's falling asleep. What does she say when I shut the book? What does she say? Again.
Yeah.
That's the way we communicate. If you had a cookout, now we used to have cookouts, right? And we will again. We'll have more cookouts. And when we do, the next cookout you go to, there'll be 30 people there. They'll all be standing around. And what are they going to be doing? They'll all be telling each other stories. And this is the way that we communicated. But somehow or another, when we came into business, we left that behind. Now we talk about spreadsheets and things like that. And people like to communicate with stories.
Yeah, I agree. So let's kind of get into the meat of it because it's a skill, right? And I think that's one of the things I'm coming to learn now. Maybe I've been a little self-deprecating or like overly hard on myself. I think I do a pretty decent job of using stories of trying to relate, some of the old classic things. The feel, felt, found. Right? I know how you feel.
Yeah.
I felt the same way. Here's what I found. Type of constructs. I remember learning that type of stuff. And some people may think of that as like an old school, if you will. But the stuff it's timeless, right? It's been working for generations and generations. And inevitably, if you talk to the top salespeople in any industry, they use storytelling, right? They found a way, as you were mentioning in our prep call, like they found a way to handle objections with stories. They found a way to open the door with stories. They find a way to kind of soothe the client's anxiety, like during times like this, with some form of telling a story of something that happened before to kind of relate that and create a parallel. So are you seeing like a knowledge gap or a confidence gap in the younger generation of advisors with stories, or is it something else, right?
Yeah.
What are you seeing that kind of makes it a necessary thing?
They don't tell stories. Most advisors and most wholesalers do not tell stories. And the reason is I got something to sell. And I'm focused on this. You got to buy it. This is a great annuity, Mike. It's got 2 bells, it's got 4 whistles, and an extra option. And that's what we focus on. We don't tell stories. They don't understand the power of stories. So, when I was wholesaling, so I was a top wholesaler for a while there at AIG. They had a lot of people, and I thought I was quite a hot shot. And then I discovered there was a guy that worked for American funds that was, for some reason or other, I don't know how, but he was making 2 or 3 times as much as I was, and he was a wholesaler. And how was he doing that? I wondered. So I got a chance to go out to American funds. That was 1998 to learn about American funds. But I went out there because this fellow was presenting. His name is Bill Banyard. And I wanted to know, what is Bill doing? What is he saying? How is he saying it? What are his habits? Why is he so much better than me? I didn't know why. And after about 2 hours, I recognized that Bill had captured me completely. And I wasn't sure why, but by noon I recognized it. And that was, he was a fantastic storyteller, and he would weave the stories into his tremendous knowledge of American funds and of the industry. And I'm telling you that you can succeed without telling stories. Clearly, as an advisor or a wholesaler, you could succeed, but you could do a whole lot more if you could be great at it. I think one of the reasons that people don't do it, besides being in a hurry, is they don't know where to get the stories. Don't know where to get it and how to create it what are the important elements. So I could touch on a little bit of that.
Let's
Uh,
do that. Yeah, because I think
yeah,
that's really interesting. You mentioned that in an email to me, and I hadn't thought to ask you that, but it is true. I think that's one of the reasons why it seizes up with people. Like, obviously some of the stories of your own personal life experience, just pop to mind or whatever. But where do you recommend that somebody get a story to facilitate, again, whether it's a sales process or it's the service process or whatever? Where do they dig up stories?
yeah. So first of all, you don't have to make any up, and you don't have to borrow anyone else's, because you have thousands of stories. They're inside your life. You're just not using them. You've got lots and lots of stories. You're just not aware of it, not really thinking about the stories. So I'll give you a couple examples here in a moment. But what you can do is you can use a particular story. You'll discover the story. You'll fashion it, and you'll use it strategically. You'll see opportunities. Whenever this opportunity comes up, I tell the Libby story when Libby was in the barn. Whenever this one comes up, I tell the Bill Banyard story. So situations will arise, and you'll pull out a story that you have told hundreds of times because it sets the stage for where you're going. Right? There's a certain strategy in using this story. So I'll give you one here in just a moment. But
Sure.
if you wanted to create a story from your life, first of all, you don't have to, as I said, you don't have to make it up. You don't have to lie about anything. Maybe you embellish a little bit to make it fun, but you have the stories. 4 things that have to be a part of the story for it to work. One is you have to be a part of it. You have to be in the story. That's number 1. Number 2 is there has to be someone else in the story who is named. You always have to name the other person. Number 3 is there has to be a time that this thing happened. And number 4 is there has to be a place. Now, it doesn't matter why those things matter, but we do know that those things make the story believable. So, Bill Banyard, Berea, California, 1998, and me. So there's 4 elements, right? So any story that you put together has got to have those four parts. And so there's a lot of different purposes for a story, but the most common one, the one I like the most, I use the most, is you could use a story to set the context for what follows. So that's the biggest use. I could give you a couple of examples, but that's the biggest use of it. You set the context. So, well, here, just for example, if an advisor is selling an income product, maybe it's some kind of an annuity or life insurance, something like that, there's 2 basic ways to do that. They could simply say in so many words, so Mike, here's the policy I want to show you. And you're going to love it. It's wonderful. It's got the 4 bells, 2 whistles, and here it is. I think you should do this. Now we'll never say that, of course, but that's what they hear if we lead with the product. If we just jump out and say, "Here's my life insurance product. This is your lucky day," that's what they hear. However, if you had told a story that sets the context in which that life insurance product solves something, if it comes to the rescue somehow, you have a reason now to talk about that policy. And it's a whole different world. It's a whole different world, setting a context with a story.
You know what I think is fascinating as we think about this, and I want to get into some specifics about how to use storytelling in a couple of different scenarios. But I'm sitting here listening, and I know many of our people in our audience are using Truelytics, and they're using Truelytics for a variety of different reasons. And one of the reasons is they are either looking to acquire another business, right? They're looking to grow their business via acquisition. And so they're getting evaluation done. They're doing some analysis on their business to improve its performance. They're using the to recruit other advisors, or they're getting set with continuity to make sure that stuff is in place. But I know that's a mindset for a lot of advisors that may be listening, and a lot of firms that may be listening, or leaders at firms. I imagine the storytelling process can be used there because one of the things we're hearing is for every seller of a financial advisory business, there are about 50 buyers out there looking to buy, right? So it's a little bit of a bidding war, a little bit of a competition, and a seller has kind of the pick of the litter, if you will, right? As you're thinking about this, how might an RIA, an ownership team at an RIA, or an individual advisor use storytelling to kind of present themselves as like, I'm the one you want to sell your business to?
So, are we talking about the person who wants to sell the business or the person that wants to buy the business?
The person who wants to buy the business, because I think that's where there's more competition. If I had an advisory business and I had, let's just say, $100 million AUM, and I basically started to let the world know that I was for sale, I was going to be exiting the business. I have a feeling there'd be advisors lining up around the door block to buy it, right? So, if
Mhm.
how do those buyers present themselves using a story? What
Yeah,
might you?
yeah. Well, that's a good question. So, this is where you would use a story. It's related to a category. In fact, you could put it into this category. So, I have 5 different categories that I use, but one is an epiphany story, right? So, as a buyer, and by the way, I know precious little about that process. I do know about Trulytics and what you do, but I've never tried to buy a firm or anything like that. But
But that's what makes this exciting.
yeah, 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 yeah,
I like the fact that you're bringing this outside perspective, right?
yeah, yeah. That's right. So if I'm buying a firm and I'm going to have a conversation with you, I would probably create some sort of a story about what I have been doing. So Mike, I've been looking for a firm now for 4 years. I've been looking for 4 years, and I see firms that look like this, and I see firms that look like this, and it looks like a match, but as it turns out, the final analysis, it's not a match. Uh, so what I've discovered is I've been looking at it the wrong way. I've been analyzing this part of it, and what I really should have been doing all along is analyzing this. So here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to get this kind of information from you, and I will know in short order whether it makes sense. I've been analyzing the wrong things. I've been expert at things that didn't really matter. I've been recently affiliated with Trulytics here. I now understand what I should really have been analyzing all along. I know what it'll take for me to buy a firm. I know what it'll take. If I have the right information, I can make a decision. I can move quickly on it if I wanted to, because now I know what I need. I mean, I was bumping around for a couple of years. I have the money to buy a firm. I want to buy a firm. I have the people to staff it. I can make it happen. I really didn't know what to look for. Now I do. Here's what I'd like you to do, Mike. I would like you to get together with Trulytics, give them the information that they're going to collect, which is quite a bit of information. But with all of that, I'll know exactly what makes sense. And you know what, Mike? If it's not a perfect fit for me, at least you will know. You'll know what the value of your firm is, and you'll probably have an easier time of it selling your firm. But the fact is, I can make a decision if I can get the right information. So anyway, so it's a story about I used to do it this way. I was trying to figure it out. I could never figure it out. I didn't know what to do, and now I discovered Trulytics, and if we use this, I can make a decision. So maybe I'd
Love it.
create a story that's off the top of my head, but I would create some kind of a story like that. I think if I was a buyer, I'd want them to know that I'm ready, willing, and able, but I got to have the right stuff, the right information, and I'm not gonna do it in the back of a napkin. If you can we work with Trulytics, we can perhaps move forward. So I think we can work out some language that would create a story. Now, what you'd have to do in that story is say, I was looking at, I looked at a firm in L.A., Los Angeles. I was thinking of going down there. It's a great firm. This guy Fred, he's got this great company, whatever. So you pull in the elements that are necessary. That is a time, a place, where it was, at least the first name. But it didn't work out because of this. And so a couple of those, the story comes to life now, and you're going off in the right direction.
I really love this approach. And I'll tell you why I like this and why I asked. Not only because it's relevant to the audience, and not only specifically relevant to Truelytics, of course, but in this process, there is some similarities with buying a house or something, right? Like, and every once in a while, it's a seller's market, and you're competing, right? How do you stand out? And very often, your realtor will say, write a little note, right, or something like that to the seller, so let them know who you are, a little bit about your family, and all. And it does make a difference, because if I have two competing offers and they're basically the same price, and in this type of a market with the sellers putting their business up, the valuation is going to be, the valuation. The price is going to be relatively the same, give or take a little bit here or there. But as Terry Mullen says all the time, many of these advisors are willing to take a little bit less when selling their business to make sure their clients are taken care of, because they really do care about these clients. They bonded with them over the decades of building the business. So I think this can make a huge difference, what you just described there. And I love that, as you described it, the epiphany approach, right? Like, look, I've
Yeah.
been searching, hunting, wanting,
Yeah, yeah. And here, I think, here comes a good opportunity to recognize the value of the right questions. I mean, I've been in this business, as I admitted to already. I was the first person in the business. I
Earth was
started
still hot back then, right? As they say.
But I was told from day one I have to have all the answers. I mean, I went to Merrill Lynch. I sat at Merrill Lynch. We used to go 6 weeks in New York City, and every day was objection, rebuttal, objection, rebuttal. You got to have every answer, George. People are going to ask you things, you better have an answer. Well, I've concluded that that's all very nice, and you should have a lot of answers. But the questions, the right questions, are actually more important than having every single answer. And in that context, in this conversation we were just having about me buying your business, Mike, it's important to have, and this whole conversation wasn't just about stories, it was about communication skills. It's important to ask the right question. So let's assume there's nobody between you and me, and I'm just talking to you about buying your business. There's no broker, there's no nothing. It's just we're talking one-on-one. One of the things that I might ask you after I learn about you, so you're going to tell me about your business. You're going to tell me that you started, this many years ago, and now you have this many assets, and you have this, that, and the other thing, and life is great, or whatever. You can tell me your story. One of the things I may ask is, so what really are you trying to get done here? Exactly. What's your objective here? What has to happen here? Now, you're 64 years old, you told me. Let's say you're 3 years out from here. What has to happen to make you happy? Well, you're going to say something like, well, by that 3 years, that's about right. I'm thinking I want to be sold by, well, certainly 5 years I want it sold, but I'd probably sell it sooner. I'd like to get it done. Yeah, I'd like to get it done. And then somewhere along the way, a much more important question. Well, let me ask you this, Mike. What's the hardest part about this for you? What's the hardest part about getting this done so that your business is sold and you're retired? What do you deal with? What keeps you up at night? Now, you may say something to the effect, well, George, you know what? Some of these people, I've had these clients for 40 years. They trust me, they love me. I want to get as much for my company as I possibly can, of course. But I got to tell you, my biggest concern is that my clients are taken care of properly, that I've sold this company to the right person, to the right company. I mean, I'm worried about that. I mean, some of these people are relatives, they're friends, they go back forever. All right. So in that conversation, having the right question, I just discovered based on that conversation, it's not always going to be this easy, that, yeah, you want to get as much as you can, but really it's about these people taken care of. Now, knowing that, I can address that. I can address that issue if I have that special capability. I can demonstrate in some fashion that those clients will be properly taken care of. And by the way, to be done most effectively, it isn't done necessarily at that very second. So you just told me it's about your clients, and I know that, and I know it's a big deal, and I put it in the back of my head, and I keep talking to you, and you also tell me that a couple of minutes later that you are concerned about your son-in-law who's still in the business and how that's going to work out. So I discovered 2 or 3 different problems, and I want the problems to keep coming at me as much as I can. I want to discover all the issues that you're concerned about. And then one at a time, I'll start working on those issues. And I'll address the biggest one first. So, the fact that you've had these people for 40 years, that's when, Mike, you talked about feel, felt, found. You can say, you know something, Mike? It's funny you say that. We acquired a firm last year in San Diego, Bill Weinstein, and it took us 2 years to pull it together. You know why? We agreed on the price. We agreed on everything. Everything was great. He was such a wreck about disappointing his clients or letting them down in some way. And we worked it out. What we did was we did this, and we did that, and we did this. So then here comes another story to the rescue, and the story is driven by questions.
I really enjoy that. And it's so funny. I have a friend of mine, Howard, who I admire, and he's been a bit of a mentor of mine over the years. And he's like the best question asker person ever, right? Like every time you have a conversation with him, he'll ask these questions like, man, why don't I do more of that? Right? Like, why don't I ask? Because he'll ask, and he'll make me think. He'll ask me a question, and then suddenly I have to think like, how do I? Yeah, that is an interesting question. I've seen him do it and had him do it to me so many times, and it's fantastic. I love it. So, but the other thing you made me think about during that part of the conversation here was I took a negotiation class during my MBA program. And one of the things that they talked about in this kind of the art of negotiation was making the distinction between a position and the interest of the person you're negotiating with, right? So very often somebody comes in and says, "This is the price of my practice. I want, 2 times revenue or whatever." In their mind, they've made this number, and they're like, "This is what my business is worth." Maybe they've had a professional valuation done through Truelytics or whatever, or maybe they have a number, or they've got something in there that this is the position they're taking. But what you just described is some probing questions to get to the interests of
Yeah.
the seller, right? So like, what are the things that they really want? Not something they just staked out on the ground, because very often, yes, some of the things they really want are what's driving that position, but very often it's not that. They just, they haven't taken the time to think about what are the things that I really want. Taking care of my clients. I want to spend more time with my wife. I want to travel more. We've been discovering lately through the work that Truelytics is doing with Skyview that more often than not, advisors aren't selling their business outright. They're not just doing 100%, like I'm going to sell my business and walk away into the sunset. Many of them are doing partial sales. They're selling, 50% of the business or 30% of the business with a contract to kind of gradually sell more of it. So they have this, what they, call a glide path out of the business versus a hard pull the ripcord type of day. Right. So it's really, really interesting. You made me think of that. I love it. Discover the interest versus the position and using questions to get there.
Right, right. Yeah. So the questions are so powerful. So if you think about that conversation I just conjured up, the questions, they were questions that revealed a problem of sorts. The problem is I don't want to leave my clients on in the lurch. The problem is my son-in-law is part of the business. The problem is this. So you're discovering problems, and if you can discover anyone's problem and somehow resolve it, there's precious few objections to that. Everybody, think about this. I mean, there's always objections. There's always objections to a financial product or a service or my offer on your business. There's always objections on these kinds of things. But there's never an objection to a solution. So everybody's got problems. So there's 7.7 billion humans walking around, and every last one has problems. So some kid in Nairobi doesn't have sneakers, and some lady in Fort Lauderdale has cancer, and my garage is dirty. Everybody has problems, and we have a lot of them. Mike, do you have any problems?
I've got lots of problems right now. I'm
See, I
helping
knew
create. Yeah.
So if you were to write a list, Mike, of 20 problems on a piece of paper, and you handed it to me, and I had a magic wand, and I wave at that list, and 10 of those problems that you have disappeared, are you going to object to that?
Of course not.
Never. There is no human being will object to problems being solved. You're just not going to do that, because if problems are solved, that means tomorrow will be a little better than today. I'm so happy that those 10 problems are gone. I'm delighted. So if we want to delight someone in the process of a sale or a purchase of a business or anyway, find a problem and address it to whatever extent you can. Sometimes we find problems that we can't fix, and so it is. But if we do find problems that we can resolve in some fashion, objections melt away and relationships bond. In the process of finding the problem, relationships will bond.
I love it. So I think I don't want to call this an objection, but I think this is a concern or an area of discomfort that I know I felt a little bit, and you've gotten to know me a little bit. You know I really do enjoy talking, and I enjoy talking with people. So not just to myself, but I love people, right? So I have no problem walking into any room of any social structure, or demographic, and I find a way to just pretty easily fit in. I've always been like that since I was a little kid. Very, very just socially flexible, if you want to call it that.
Yeah.
But one thing that, as I'm listening to you talk, and I've heard other professionals who are whether they're in sales training or that they are teaching communication skills, one of the things that I sense that is an area of discomfort is I listen to you talk and it's like, this sounds like a script from a movie. Like I almost feel like it, like as an example, or to I guess to put it another way, it's clearly that there's been some effort and some work to hone this skill. And whether you've rehearsed the story, as you've talked about, you tell the same story 1,000 times or whatever, and you kind of rework it to fit the situation. But and even the questions like, if I could solve that problem, would you want me to?
Yeah.
What are your recommendations to help people kind of get comfortable with that? Because I think for some people, they're not like this is new stuff for them.
Yeah. So expand on it a little bit. I think I know where you're going with that, but I'm not 100% sure.
Whether it's storytelling or the process of asking follow-up questions that just they're different for people, right? So many advisors, right? They get in and they're good salespeople. Some I think the more modern, newer crop of advisors, the younger folks, are getting into the financial advisory business because they like finance. They studied finance in college, and they're thinking they might want to manage money, and then they went and got their CFP and so forth. The last piece is learning kind of the people skills, right? The old school dudes who grew up as stockbrokers were shucking product, as you're saying, right? And they learned how to either move product, or they learned how to use certain social triggers or whatever. And then some of the really good ones, as you mentioned, learn stories. But during the conversational process of, hey, George, I know how you feel here. Let me tell you a little bit about something that happened to me recently. And you start going through the process. And, have you ever had that happen to you? These types of questions, there's a polish to it. Do you know what I'm saying? That I think is honed, right? It almost feels like it's a script from a movie.
Yeah. So I guess we're all subject to that happening, I suppose. If we've been doing the same thing for a long, long time, I suppose we're subject to that. But ultimately, it's got to be conversational. But that doesn't mean it's not without structure and strategy. To me, if you don't have a strategy, so look at this. If you were putting a presentation together, whether it's for one person or 100 people, there's some rules to putting it together. You do have to have a strategy, and sometimes, I suppose, if it sounds too polished, and it can, I know that. So that's to your detriment. But the other side of it is to not have it figured out enough, and to be wandering about, So presentation skills in general, I have to tell you, 1994, I made my first presentation as a wholesaler. It was what was Kidder Peabody at the time. Some of you go back that far. It was Boston, Kidder Peabody, Boston. And my very first presentation, manager's name was Frank something. And I thought I did a good job, a decent job. I was a wreck. I was very nervous. Talk about polished. I'm on the other side of the spectrum. I wasn't very good. Anyway, I was telling about Boston Capital Tax Credit Fund, so limited partnership story. So I gave this presentation, and this is my first one, my first presentation as a wholesaler. And I got done, and the manager said, "Thank you for that, young man. Thank you for that. And could you come in my office for a moment?" I said, "Oh, geez, I'm in trouble, probably." So I went in, and he said, "Well, thanks a lot." He said, "I just finished a book, and when you leave here, you should go buy this book. It's a book called Presenting to Win, and it's by Jerry Weissman, Weissman. It is the most incredibly powerful book about how to make sure your presentation makes sense. That it's a good presentation. Weissman is the guy who helped Intel and Oracle and all those companies raise money in the early days. They were very smart, but they were terrible presenters, and he was the guy that helped them. But there's 5 sins that you can commit, and I would rather be sometimes a little too polished, perhaps, than commit one of these 5 sins. I'll give them to you. And So this is whether you're creating a PowerPoint presentation or you're going to go talk to the school principal about your kid breaking the window. Right? Same thing. So 5 sins. Number 1 is no point B. So any presentation is supposed to take you from A to B, and no point B. I mean, what was the point? You don't even understand. What am I supposed to do now? I don't know what to do, right? So this guy, Frank, said to me, "You had no point B, George. I don't know what to do." So number 2 was no audience benefit. Can that happen? Oh, sure. I was talking to 50 financial advisors about why their clients should invest in tax credits. I never said a word about why they should be involved. That they were the audience. I never gave an audience benefit. All right. Number 3, no clear flow. Unstructured, totally unstructured. So the antithesis, Mike, what you're talking about. Too structured, perhaps. Okay. My presentation was dreadful. It was circular. It was dreadful. Number 4, too long. Right. So I stayed within the time limits, but Frank said to me, "I thought it was never going to end." And then the last element of this, according to Weissman, the 5 sins. This is a sin. So I don't know if we have any Catholics in the audience. I suppose we do. I'm a Catholic, and Catholics have a pretty good deal because you can sin and then you can just go confess it. You're okay, so you get away with a lot of stuff.
Get out of jail free card.
Yeah, I know it's good. So in fact, if you might consider, if you're not a Catholic, you might consider signing up because you get away with a lot of stuff. Anyway, look. So anyway, look what I discovered on these 5 sins. This last one, sin number 5, is not forgivable. Yeah, even if you're a good Catholic or whoever you are, you will pay the price for this if you commit this sin. And in the business that we are in, we are constantly falling prey to this problem. Too complex. Way too complex. We know a hell of a lot, and we think that they want to know what we know, and we load them up. Way too complicated. So I really recommend this book. It's a great, great book, Presenting to Win. These 5 sins help you put together a presentation that makes sense and is well received and is powerful. And yeah, I would have to agree that sometimes we can be perhaps too practiced at certain parts of things, but it's better. It's better than falling prey to these kinds of issues, you know?
I really appreciate that you took through those, those kind of those 5 sins, and you, by the way, you use a story to kind of answer the question to help, I guess, develop a better appreciation for how somebody can gain a level of comfort with using this type of technique in their business and in their daily life, right? It does come down to practice, and it comes down to learning a few skills and building a couple of elements in there, right? You mentioned like every story should have, these 4 core elements. And then you mentioned here at the end, as we're wrapping things up, you mentioned, these 5 sins, and you gave a specific recommendation for a book that somebody can get to help themselves. Those things anybody can achieve, and you're going to have your own voice. And so, I give recommendations to people who are going to be using podcasting as a medium very frequently. And sometimes people are uncomfortable, especially the first time they hear their own voice coming through the headset.
Yeah.
They're like, "Whoa, I sound like that." It's like, yeah, that's okay. And by the way, you notice people don't run away from you when you're talking to them. It's because your voice is fine, right? They're comfortable with your voice. Just because you've never heard it in a pair of headsets before, lots of people have. They've been on the phone with you, they've been on Zoom calls with you and all that type of stuff. So it just takes a little while to develop comfort with anything, frankly. And so working in these new things, even if you're like, I'm not sure if that's me, it's like you can make it your own. It's okay. I love it. So hey, listen, as we close things out here, I know I have a high level of confidence that people who have listened to this are going to have lots of questions. They're going to want to follow up. I'm sure some RIA firms and independent broker dealers are like, wow, George really taught a lot. I'd like to get him in front of an audience of my advisors. What is going to be the best way for somebody to follow up with you? And what are some things that they would want to, in addition to storytelling, obviously, follow up with you about, like to bring you in to help with their advisor population?
Yeah, yeah. Well, so first off, I'm just relaunching a website, nextlevel.solution.com. The website will be next, NEXTLVL, solution.com. In the meantime, of course, I'm on LinkedIn, and there's a lot of information about me on LinkedIn. And, I'm easily reached through LinkedIn and email and all of those things. I'm pretty easily reached. So what I do is I do wholesaler development, coaching, training, and speaking to advisors. So a lot of wholesalers, at least when we were able to do this, a lot of wholesalers would set up a meeting and have 35 people at Maggiano's for lunch, and I would go and do those meetings. That literally thousands of them, I'm quite certain. And these days, it would perhaps be a Zoom meeting. But I'm happy to talk to anybody about any of these kinds of things. But it's primarily wholesaler and advisor training and development around things like communication skills is one element. So there's a lot of other elements to be an advisor. There's how many clients should you have? How many clients do you have? Are you going the direction you want to go? And so I was an advisor for so long, but beyond that, I've known the best of the best. I have met so many extraordinary advisors, and I have learned so much that I just spread the word is basically what I do. I learn from some people, and I take it to others. So I'm happy to talk to anyone about these kinds of things. Can I leave you with one quick thought about the importance of this communication skills,
Yeah,
Mike?
please do. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So your advisors, they do a lot of things. There's financial planning, there's research, there's so many different things that they do. But if they are not communicating, if they stop communicating today, if your advisor doesn't talk starting today, they have received their last check. That's it. It's all over. So ultimately, it comes down to their ability to communicate effectively. So Doris and I are watching TV in our house, Plymouth, Massachusetts, July 27th. 2004. There's a fellow, looks like he's applying for a job on TV. And people had told him that he shouldn't do that. He wasn't well known. It was a pretty big job. But Barack Obama got up on the stage, Democratic National Convention, and gave a presentation. And many people will tell you that that laid the groundwork for him to become the president and therefore the most powerful human being in the entire planet. And politics aside, it doesn't matter. Many have said, and I believe it's true, that he became that most powerful human on his ability to communicate effectively. And that was a big part of it. Now, maybe of course there were other things, but that played a huge part. And if that could happen for him and many others, what could it do for your business? If you're an advisor, what if you could communicate twice as good as you do now, or 3 times as good? What could it do for you? I submit that it could do a lot. Yeah, quite a bit.
Well, that's a fantastic way to leave us. Well, George, I really appreciate you carving out the time today. I know we covered a lot of ground here and is incredibly valuable. So I thank you very much.
Well, I'm very thrilled to have done it. Thrilled to have been on.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you, sir. Have a good one.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Modern Financial Advisor podcast. It is always a huge honor to have you joining us. Please do keep those questions and suggestions coming for topics or guests to have on the show. Send those in to podcast@truelytics.com or hit us up on the socials. You can find Truelytics on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, right? We are out there and listening. We want to hear from you because that's where a lot of the guests come from, right? As I mentioned, every week we keep hearing from people saying, hey, I think this person would be really great for this show, or I'd like to be on this show. Now, occasionally, if the person has no relevance whatsoever to the financial advisor community, obviously those people don't find their way onto this podcast. But if you have a relevant message, a relevant teaching for the modern financial advisor community, we do want to hear from you. So again, podcast@truelytics.com, or you can hit me up. I'm at Mike Langford pretty much anywhere. You can find me on the interwebs. I'm hanging out. I'm there. I'm ready. Also, huge thanks to George MacAllister for joining us today. Be sure to check out his newly launched website, which is Next Level Solution with no E in the level. So it's NEXTLVL solution.com, or reach out to him on LinkedIn. Everybody likes hearing from other people on LinkedIn, so long as, again, you're relevant. And by the way, little LinkedIn tip, use the little add a note feature where you send somebody a LinkedIn contact request and be genuine. Hey, George, I want to connect with you because I heard you on the Modern Financial Advisor podcast with Mike. Want to run something by you, want to talk to you about how you can help our firm, whatever that is, but be genuine, be like a normal human, like you're talking to a regular person. It works. You'd be surprised. Also, huge thanks to Jeremy Carnell and Terry Mullen at Truelytics for introducing me to George, because I've really enjoyed getting to know George. And like I said, I think he crushed it in this episode. So it's always great meeting new people and expanding the network that well. Lastly, please stay safe and healthy. Make sure you're wearing your mask, keeping your distance. Nobody likes being crowded anyway. Remember pre-pandemic times when people would stand way too close to you in line at the store or at the coffee shop? You hated that. So keep your distance now and wear your mask. It's not that big of a deal, okay? And of course, make sure you're being nice to each other, okay? We're all on the same team and we're going to get through this together, okay? We will see you next time on the Modern Financial Advisor podcast. See ya. Bye.